Hello, I'm Aiden, and I'd like to talk to you about why housing costs so much in America. In a few moments, we'll be transitioning to footage taken of me walking around my neighborhood, where we can see the real world expression of our zoning code and can talk about how it makes market rate housing unaffordable. And this is my neighborhood. I live a bit more than 1,000 feet from campus as the crow flies, and as you can see, the neighborhood mostly consists of a few small apartments and many single family homes. The area is zoned to allow for multifamily residences, but development isn't exactly breakneck on that front. You might be familiar with the usual complaints about zoning: how single family zones prevent so called missing middle development, how exclusionary zoning, also known as Euclidean zoning, prevents mixed land use, stuff like that. And that matters. It does. But it's not a silver bullet for affordability. As we look around my neighborhood, keeping in mind that multifamily residences are allowed to be built here, is there anything else you're noticing about my neighborhood that's driving up the cost of housing here? The thing I think is my neighborhood's greatest problem, and Tempe's greatest problem, isn't how tall the buildings are, or how many unrelated people are allowed to live in a single building. It's how much space is being used for nothing. Tempe isn't New York. It's not Chicago. It's not even Boston. Tall buildings have their place in Tempe, but with a population density only a little more than a tenth of a city like Paris, not being able to build tall isn't Tempe's primary cause for unaffordability. On top of that, lots must be a minimum size of over 2,000 square feet and no smaller. This forces people to consume much more land than they are often able to afford. Pile that on top of minimum parking requirements, and you end up with people spending a lot more on land than they often want or need, and wasting most of it. But so far, we've only been looking on the outside. We can see in my neighborhood all these massive lawns and massive lots, but what you can do inside the home matters just as much when it comes to making housing affordable. Zoning standards make it so that, even for rental units, every single unit must use a minimum of at least 220 square feet. It is quite literally illegal to build smaller units, no matter what people are willing or not willing to pay for. So not only are developers forced to buy a certain minimum amount of land, not only are they forced to leave much of it unused, they are also forced to make rooms in buildings larger than some people can or want to afford. What this does is introduce a very high price floor for both rental and owned homes. The easiest way to spend less money on something is to consume less of it. And that simply is not allowed in America. I'm sure many, even most, of my neighbors are happy with the space they have. But preventing people from using less space and forcing so much land to go to waste has eradicated Tempe's ability to produce cheap, market rate housing. Of course, we could get into a debate about the merits of privately built, for-profit housing development versus the building of public housing, but that's a whole nother debate. Besides, even enthusiastic supporters of public housing should be willing to acknowledge that making market rate housing more affordable is an important goal to strive for. With all of this in mind, I'd like to do something of a thought exercise. I'd like you to imagine this neighborhood if it wasn't required by law to consume so much land. Would any of these houses be smaller? Would the lawns be smaller? Maybe without so much land being wasted, you could possibly imagine other pedestrians walking within view. or less cars passing by. I don't really know myself. Even if we make it so that people are able to use less space if they would prefer it, how many people would do so? It's good that the option would be there, but I don't really know to the degree that it would affect our urban fabric. Perhaps that's thinking too small, though. Being able to build cheap housing anywhere wouldn't just change how our buildings look, it would change our communities. It would deal a great blow to income and racial segregation, and allow people more choice in where they live. It wouldn't fix everything, but it would help a lot of people in a lot of ways, and that matters. Our current zoning code was founded on discrimination and oppression, and removing the tools that the powerful have used to push down others is essential. Now, this walk continues for a few minutes more, but I'd like to switch scenes to a different walk I took to highlight how these issues affect more than just the cost of housing. And here we are. I took this next video in the early morning walking my dog, who you can see there. Hello, Charlie. This is Maple Street, just west of Mill Avenue, and I'm about to reach Mill in a couple seconds. This second clip will be shorter than the first, but I wanted to show how empty Mill is. The campus is just right across the street, and over 50,000 students are enrolled in the Tempe campus. But it doesn't feel like it, not when you're on Mill. In a few moments, we'll be able to see the university itself, as well as how empty the area is. Commercial businesses are affected just as much by being forced to consume more space than they want or need. Zoning may be crushing our housing supply, but it's also crippling our businesses. Looking at Mill, its most defining feature isn't any of the buildings, it's the road. So much space is wasted that driving is simply a necessity to get to most places. In trying to make our cities appear like we're in the rural countryside, the most defining feature of our communities has become its asphalt. Getting to the corner, in the distance, we can see the few areas where we have been permitted to build close and tall, but otherwise, there is hardly anything to see. I'd rather not go much deeper into how zoning hurts businesses, as that is a whole nother topic. But I wanted to show this to drive home how profoundly constricting zoning laws are hurting on every front. Bringing things to a close, I'd like to emphasize what we learned and propose solutions. Our current zoning code does enormous harm in ways beyond the obvious. It costs us personally to use more land than we might otherwise. It costs us by preventing others from building more on the same limited amount of land, preventing supply from increasing while demand does. It hurts businesses in the same way. If we want to fix this problem, there are two big policy measures I think would go a long ways toward fixing our broken zoning laws. Firstly is moving the writing of zoning codes to the state or federal level. The narrow and parochial visions of local politicians strengthen the voices of local NIMBY groups who want to control how their communities look. The second proposal would be a land value tax, preferably a high one, but a smaller one would be helpful as well. This would force people to reckon with the real cost of the space we waste in our determination to pretend that suburban living is fit to be imposed on the whole of the nation with no consequence. And that's the end of my presentation. Or video, I guess? I'm not that good with thinking off the top of my head. Sorry. Thank you again, and goodbye.